Welcome, everybody. My name is Jennifer Channin. I am the Executive Director of the Better Food Foundation. And this is the third webinar in our series, Shifting Food Norms, where we talk to experts about our food system, about changing people's eating behavior, and creating a world where plant-based food is the norm. Today's webinar is co-sponsored by the Center for Food Systems Transformation at the University of San Diego, and I'd like to share a warm welcome on behalf of Dr. Erin Gross, the director of the center, and a longtime collaborator with our guest today, Christopher Carter. The theme of today's webinar is how identity shapes people's food choices. And I think that this is a really important topic because of how it builds on and complements our previous two speakers. Our last two speakers, Cass Sunstein and Sophie Atwood, both talked about behavioral science and the power of defaults and other nudges. But each of them emphasized that nudges and choice architecture, while very powerful motivators of people's diets, they don't work in a vacuum. And sometimes defaults and other nudges will fail or even backfire. And when we look into the reasons why, it often is the case that it's because we didn't really pay enough attention to identity. And we ended up trying to nudge people towards changes that conflict with or rub up against their strongly held identities. So that's why we wanted to focus on the issue of identity today. And I'm very excited to introduce you to our guest. Our guest today is Reverend Dr. Christopher Carter. He's here wearing multiple hats. He's the Associate Professor of Theology, Ecology, and Race at Methodist Theological School in Ohio, lead pastor at Westwood United Methodist Church in Los Angeles, and co-host of the Progressive Christians podcast. His book, Spirit of Soul Food, Race, Faith, and Food Justice, has been featured in Food with Mark Bittman, the LA Times, and TheGrio. Christopher is also a Faith and Food Fellow with the Better Food Foundation and has been active in a variety of organizations working to create a more just food system, particularly through plant-centered diets. So I've spoken a lot about you now. Christopher, can you tell us a bit about yourself? I know we have many people with us today from academia, in food systems advocacy, but probably fewer people who are coming from the faith-based world. Can you tell us a bit more about how you got to the combination of vocations you have, and particularly how you came to be a clergy person?
Yeah, no, well, thank you, Jennifer, for having me. I'm excited to be here, and have been at doing my best to support the work that y'all have been doing for years. Very grateful to be in relationship with the BFF. And I think it's so funny when I saw this question, it reminded me actually of the first time I was talking with Mark Bittman, actually, because he asked me something similar. Mark is Jewish, and uh, so we're just spitballing like after our conversation on his podcast, and he was like, "Why?" He's like, "Why did you even use religion to make your argument?" He's like, "I still don't understand." Even after I had talked to him about it, and I think what I realized is that so much of my core identity growing up was steeped in the Black church tradition. Like I'm from a small town in the Midwest, Battle Creek, Michigan. My mother's family, for the most part, played a really big role in raising me. My grandparents are from Mississippi, and we grew up going to church 2 or 3 times a week. But it wasn't like the kind of what I've come to realize when I talk about Black church, especially to non-Black audiences. I really have to talk about it from the perspective of community. Like this was such a part of who I understood myself to be. So much of my ethics and my norms and how I saw the world grew out of this vision of, especially as a child, what I saw as a beloved community, as people who needed each other because we grew up in a very racialized and a very segregated part of the country, who depended on each other for work and for food, and for relationships. And it wasn't perfect by all means. I don't look back at it with a sense of nostalgia, like, oh, everything was great, but it did give me such a framework of understanding the kind of person I wanted to be, the values that I grew up in, what I would understand now to be a more liberatory framework church, like because we were in Michigan. I always tell people it was so pro-union. I grew up with a solidarity framework that was kind of implicit in the theology. And these are the things that happened to me organically. And so I think looking back on the arc of my life, I see my understanding of Christianity, my understanding of religion as such, as a way that I practiced and live out these moral norms. And I don't know that I could do it any other way because it's so embedded in who I am. Even if I tried to write something outside of that scope, it's still gonna seep through because it's a part of who I am. The last thing I'll say is I'm a husband, I'm a father. My wife, I still, but my wife is the smarter of the two of us. She's a veterinary oncologist, and she is a genius practically, and I'm very grateful for that relationship. With her, I have a son, and I think my son is 6 years old. My son is also disabled, and so there's a lot that goes in my thinking now with respect to like intellectual disabilities and even when you're thinking about food choices and how he has forced me to expand my thinking around that area in certain ways as well. So yeah, so that's a bit about me and kind of some of my identities.
Yeah, well, that's a great segue into the next question, because we all have multiple identities. You know, myself, at any given time, certain identities are more prominent. I'm a woman, I'm Brazilian, I'm a nonprofit ED, I'm a wife, I'm a Unitarian Universalist minister, and these identities have connected with my food journey. You know, I've been vegan for the last 10 years. Before that, I had a variety of different diets, and often how I ate depended on kind of how easily that kind of diet meshed with the identities that I held most strongly at that time. Um, you talk about in your book, and I know you to have many identities. You just mentioned some of them. You're a father, a husband, a clergy person, an academic, you're Black, you're Christian. Um, have these identities, how have these identities been supportive or challenging to you in your own dietary journey, in your own choice to want to eat a more plant-based or plant-centered diet? Have all of them been supportive? Have some of them been unsupportive? What's that
I
been like?
It's been complicated. I would say like not, like it's like everybody else. Like I would say it's a complicated journey, but um, you know, it was a journey, and I would say, one of some of my good friends who've known me, especially when I started my so you all should know I'm also a first generation college student. Like my grandpa was a migrant picker. My mama, um, barely graduated high school, and I never saw myself going to college, quite honestly. My wife pushed me to go to college. As a adult, I was already working in my 20s when I went to school. And so by the time I got to graduate school and meet people, I thought I knew who I was, I should say. I thought I was more formed in terms of my and I would say actually I was pretty formed in my moral norms and ethical commitments. I think what I learned to do is what does it mean for me to live consistently, to try to live with a particular kind of moral consistency. If I believe in love, justice, and compassion, which are things I brought with me to graduate school, to seminary when I felt called to ministry, what does it mean to apply that consistently? And I think um, in every aspect of my life. And that has been something I've continually like strove to do. And that led me to the food journey that I'm at. I talk about a little bit of that journey because in the beginning of graduate school, I would have barbecues and all kinds of things over at my dorm because I love to grill, I love to cook, and I would have never imagined myself becoming vegan, in 2007 is when I'm talking about. But looking back, even the way I thought about food as a kind of communal praxis for developing relationships, as a way to bring people together to have conversation, these are things that were steeped and built in me from, my grandmother, especially, which is part of the reason why I like her recipes or core parts of her recipes are in my book. Um, what ended up happening was as I um, was driving, actually, poor grad student, I don't have enough money to go to American Academy of Religion. At this time, it was in San Francisco, and I was driving from San Francisco or driving from Los Angeles to San Francisco, and I noticed on the five just I was really unaware of the impact of industrial agriculture on the Latino community. Like I understood it intellectually, but I hadn't seen it. But I was very much aware of the experiences of my grandfather growing up picking cotton and just being a picker and the stories he told of just the way in which, like my grandpa was born in 1934, but he talks and we tell stories. It sounds like, I mean, if you were to read Booker T. Washington's Up from Slavery, like when he talks about like the way he lived, that's what it sounds like. It was terrible, just absolutely abject, terrible conditions. Um, and I think there's a part of me that felt like that was like old timey. You know, I was like, ah, people aren't treated like that anymore. And then when I saw it, because it's hidden, you know, I think you know in my grandpa's time, you know, if you were to go, like I take students on a, I have a class that I take students to the American South. Where I show them places that were very visible, where you see plantations that still exist, that's like people get married at, uh, that you could see the ways in which this was much more visible in that time in that period where my grandpa was a young person doing this work. It's just it is more hidden now, and I think me seeing it, I was really able to draw the connection between the oppressions my grandfather spoke about, the oppressions that I see Latinx farm workers working with, and the oppressions that we see taking place in industrial agriculture as relates to um, meat packing and I think drawing these connections was critical for me. Um, I knew that I love Black people, and I knew my research was about supporting my community and other marginalized communities, and that's continued to expand. That's what I say, other marginalized communities. That's continued to expand to what I would call a broader anti-oppressive ethic. But what it forced me to do was to really wrestle with my commitment to my own community and how I was going to be able to articulate a message to them as to, okay, now I have drawn this understanding that by participating in eating animals, eating non-human animals, I'm complicit in a system that disproportionately harms my community from environmental pollution, that its logic is premised on the dehumanization or thinkification of humans, basically of black people, and the animalization of black folks is one of the critical elements for the support of racism, um, for the continued support of white supremacy, one might say. And so I think for me, all these things became so entangled. The only way to make sense of them was to step back and say, all right, I need to opt out of a system that I know harms my own people first and foremost. How do I go about doing that? And I think rather than jumping in it in a way where some people are like, I have to stop everything all at once, I just did a more gradual approach because I love to cook. And I just was like, okay, these are the things I like to eat. How can I make them vegetarian? And I just kept working on that, working on it, till ultimately, actually, it was Aaron. I was still calling myself vegetarian, maybe even to like 2017 or something. And but I wasn't really. I think I called myself a dirty vegan or something like that. I can't quite remember. But like, it's because I had this idea that vegan had this kind of purity to it. And if anybody has grown up in a religious space, this purity culture is so dangerous and terrible, and it does so much harm. And I think I was applying that same kind of logic to what it meant to be vegan, even though in my mind I was already toying with the idea of vegan as a praxis, black veganism as I call it. And so having conversations with people like Aaron pushed me to think critically about what am I talking about when I'm talking about being vegan and the kind of consciousness around a liberatory framework and consciousness around eating in ways that uplift and support my community and allow me to still be myself. And so I just had to veganize the food I was eating and find ways to that way I can eat in a way that still was in alignment with my values and in alignment with my community and be able to articulate why I was doing this. And the last thing I'll say, because I've talked too long, was what gave me the confidence when I was doing it right. As I was giving a lecture, I know we have somebody in here from UC Irvine. I just saw the name on here. And I was giving a lecture there, and one woman was from the same town as my dad's family, is from Hammond, Louisiana. And it's random because Hammond is not that big of a city. And they had cooked the recipes from my book for this workshop, and she ate the recipes, and she was eating it like a food critic. Like she had it all separated on these different trays, and she was eating it. And then when we finished, I didn't know who this lady was, black lady. She was like, I have to say, this tastes so good. She's like, it doesn't taste exactly like what I would cook if I had meat in it. She's like, but it tastes so close, and I know it's so much better for my community. She didn't say so much better for her or for her health or anything like that. She's like, this is better for my community. She's like, you made me think differently. You forced me to think differently about my imagination of what is possible. And so much of this is igniting people's imaginations, right? Of saying, you've imagined vegan as white. You've imagined these things as supporting of white middle class norms. And what I'm telling you is that there's another way for us to reimagine what this food can be that is more in alignment with who we are, rather than who we imagine our oppressor to be. And so that's kind of how I try to walk through managing my identities and kind of how I got here. And I apologize for the long answer.
No, that was fantastic. What's funny to me, something you and I share in common is that you and I were both people who were, vegetarian-ish, kind of mostly plant-based until we met Aaron Gross. Had a lot of deep conversations about religion and social justice, and then we're like, well, I guess I have to be vegan now.
That's basically, I was like, "Yeah, okay, well, I guess now, I mean, and sometimes you need someone to help shepherd you through and draw those connections. And I think,
I'll say Aaron
uh,
Gross is the director of the Center for Food Systems Transformation at the University of San Diego, which is co-sponsoring this talk.
yeah, Aaron is, Aaron is I owe so much of my, career, to be honest with you, like to someone who really could see what I was trying to do. And I think that's the hard part, also, I should say, as a person of color in this work, is finding support. Like just finding people that want to support you and believe in what you're doing. And that makes it a bit more challenging too, that sometimes people don't think about, because you're going to deal with a lot of people who give you resistance. One of my students from school, I'm her thesis advisor, Shima, is on the call, and I know the work she's trying to do with environmental justice. And when you're black and doing this work that people don't fully understand how it can connect to dealing with anti-racism, you get a lot of pushback. And so you have to be so sophisticated in making your argument as to like why this matters to us, why this matters to our community, but also why it matters beyond that as well. But if you can't articulate that message, people will think that that you're doing things to act in ways that aren't, the word I want to use, quite honestly, the phrase I want to use is act white. But that's not what I mean by that. Is you're living in ways that are supporting an oppressive system rather than living in ways that undo the oppressive system. Like you're adopting white norms, principles, and ideologies. And I'm sorry to make this so binary because it really isn't. But in a way, the black-white binary is the framework with which we understand the racial logics of this country. And that's the language that people really use a lot. So I don't mean to do that to dismiss other dynamics, but I want to be clear, like within my own context, that's a lot of the language I would hear.
I encounter that thinking a lot in doing advocacy around plant-based food, where I'm giving a talk to some organization, and then I get a question like, oh, okay, clearly plant-based diets are good for the environment. They have benefits for, health in our food system, but, this is an elite thing. This is a white thing. This is only for white affluent people. And then what I'll usually do is I'll share this statistic. I'm sure you're aware of this. A few years ago, the Pew Commission did a study of dietary habits in America, and what they discovered was that 8% of African Americans, far more than white people, I think it was 3% of white people, 8% of African Americans report having some kind of plant-based diet, and that plant-based eating or plant-forward eating is growing rapidly amongst African Americans and other non-white people in comparison to white people. And I'll share this statistic because it's just the hard truth. And if you go to cities with large Black populations like Atlanta or Baltimore, it's also visible, it's visceral. You see the restaurants and you're like, yeah, there's a lot of vegan restaurants here. And yet, that basic data, sometimes it's like people can't believe it. It's so hard for them to believe that it's true. Um, why do you think that's true?
I
Why
think
do you think, yeah.
I think it's partly because, we're so conditioned to have these, these ideological assumptions around people that we project onto them because sometimes we don't, again, have an imagination to believe people are capable of thinking or being something that is beyond the identity be projected upon them or has been projected upon them. Um, and the narrative of Black foodways, or I shouldn't say the narrative, the image of what Black foodways is, and the narrative projected upon Black people, particularly as it relates to what we believe to be diet related issues and causes of death is so deeply embedded in people, it's hard to escape. And one of the things that was helpful for me, I don't know if I have this book behind me. I might be able to find it quickly, but I can't. Oh yeah, I can. There's a book up there. I'll reach up in a minute. It's called Weathering by Arlene Geronimus. Um, and she's a professor at the University of Michigan, and she writes about the ways in which the impacts of being person of color, particularly black. She started her research looking at black women's maternal mortality and why it was safer for black women to have children in their like early 20s and late teens versus their mid to late 30s when they had the financial security to support them. And what she found was just the daily stressors of living in a racist society basically eats away at you. And so much of what I think much of our society thinks are health related causes to dietary issues within Black and brown communities can be traced back to not only a healthcare system that is racialized and racist, but just the everydayness, what she calls weathering, like literally the wearing away of us. I mean, I tell you, like, so as an example, I take medication for high blood pressure. Uh, I am I'm training for a half marathon. I run a sub 2 hour half marathon, so it's 13 miles. That's not super fast, but it's pretty fast. I'm a vegan, and for all intents and purposes, like all the ways in which you might measure things of people, like I am very healthy, and yet I still have to deal with the chronic issues related to the daily stressors of my embodiment, you know? And so that really, you know, not being able to control my stress and blood pressure and have to have all this work on my heart, um, it's scary, but it really helps me understand the impact of these things on us. And so yeah, I think it's about broadening our imaginations and believe and recognizing that that people are more complex than we think they are. So approaching them with curiosity, I think is really, really helpful. Thank you for Julie for putting the book in the chat. It's an amazing, amazing book. If any of you haven't read, I highly, highly, highly recommend it.
Something else you and I share in common is that we've both been pastors in congregations. You still are. I used to be. And I was a minister in a very progressive liberal congregation, the kinds of people who go to social justice protests and are very vocal about their support for environmentalism and wanting to fight climate change. And yet, I found the congregations to be one of the more difficult places to try to encourage plant-centered eating. You know, the evening potluck, the Sunday morning coffee and bagels, you know, whatever format it is, uh, trying to make changes to the kinds of food that's served. It was a little scary and we encountered some resistance. I'm wondering what your experience has been in congregations and if you've had any success or challenges around uh, changing the actual food that's served in the communities that you lead.
Yeah, I've had success and some challenges, but more fortunately more success. I think, again, coming from the black church tradition, the senior pastor carries a lot of moral authority, and so a lot of things I would decide, it is because what I'm doing, people it give it more weight and it happens. But um, when I was the first church I was a senior pastor, I was in church in Compton. An interesting thing that I discovered was many of the older black women there I would identify as vegetarian, or they ate very, very little meat, very little red meat, very little chicken, very little fish. But they would have never called themselves vegetarian because they conceptually understood that to be something that was wrapped around in like white women. And that was always interesting to me. And when I would ask them about that, they were saying they're making choices that they felt like their bodies responded better to the way they ate. They found much more of the patriarchal framework around meat consumption as well. So you're thinking of oh, I can't think of her name right now, but I'm sure y'all thinking of the name of the book about the absent referent with respect to the sexual politics of meat. Um, and I realized that what I needed to do was to give voice to some of the things that I felt like they were already doing with respect to the ways they were eating. And so I started talking, this was in 2010. So this is way before. This is literally the early gestational period of the spirit of soul food. Like I started talking about my own, at that time, vegetarianism, why I was doing it, and I started cooking. And this is a church at that time, probably like 75 people, so really small. Um, and that helped transform that community to be more, I wouldn't call it plant-based, but definitely more vegetarian, and talk more about why we ate what we ate, and they began thinking theologically about food. And I think for me that's always been critical, is let's, if we again believe these norms, what does it mean for us to apply them consistently? And so then um I have The Beast of Burden by Sonara Taylor right behind me. I don't know if you can see. Maybe it's in another space, but anyway, like I have it right back there too. No, it's a great book. Somebody just put it in the chat. So yes, I have. But anyway, now getting back on topic. Um, the thing that happened when I was in my current church in Westwood, which is a very very wealthy church, uh, and it's predominantly white but multiracial, was I didn't have the same kind of moral authority, but I felt like I had more a stronger persuasive case and argument. And so the first several months I was there, I didn't really try to do anything. I talked about my vegan identity, and I talked about my work and my writing. Um, but I kept talking about what we identified our values. And I was like, these are the values we live by. That was the key. Like, so I had a plan basically. And I was like, these are the values we have. We're talking about these values. And if you talk about the values enough, and then you start up saying, okay, what does it mean to apply this value to this subject area? People start making these connections. And so after I had done this for about 8 months, this was the time so this would have been in the summer. I did a sermon series around food and eating, and I said, I want us to take a vote on going default vegetarian as a congregation so we know where we are, you know. And it's after I made the case, and everybody at this point understood collectively why we needed to go this way. But it was through a more persuasive education and framework and argument rather than saying this is what we're going to do. For me, a lot of the things that need to happen is we need to take more of a long, and it's weird when I say long view. I'm talking about like a year, and that's not in my that doesn't feel that long to me. In terms of thinking about how long it takes people to understand why they need to make a change that's so deeply tied to who they understand themselves to be. People's, as you all know, food matters so much to their identity. And so like we need to give people space and grace. And I think maybe because I approach people like that, like I'm very genuine. I'm not trying to belittle them, or I really try to understand. I want to know why they eat the thing they eat, and why does it matter to them? What's the story behind it? And I think when you approach people like that, they're more open to what you have to say. And I'm not trying to change how they eat at home. I'm trying to change how we're going to eat in church, because this is a space that we're gathered to be in solidarity with the mart. Like I always tell people, like, from in my church is a progressive church. I'm like, hey, I believe Jesus came to abolish the conditions that create hell on earth. That's what I say. That's what I'm talking about. And so we're talking about what can we do to be about the work of abolition, like, and this is a part of that process. This is a part of that praxis. Praxis, I mean. And they can see that and they buy into it. And I'll be honest, like there's several people in my church who have become vegetarian. No one that I know has become a vegan, but many of them have become vegetarian since I've been there, because it's been and two of which have not they didn't they didn't want to. They would say this wasn't by choice. This was just by continually thinking about it. Like it's the conscience. Like it's that conscience grew on them. Like, you know what? I probably shouldn't eat this. And it's been I think that's, for me, being in this community has been much more of a I have found like it's a more successful way rather than trying to feel like I'm just yelling at people. is much more inviting people to be their better selves.
Yeah. You mentioned a few things that I think are good tips for doing plant-based advocacy in faith-based communities, or really any kind of close-knit community. You talked about helping people connect this diet change to the deep values of their community, to the theology of your church, to the social justice values of your community. You also talked about encouraging a vegetarian by default policy or a plant-based by default policy. This is also a good practice because it's a way for a community to commit to a plant-based change without necessarily taking away choice. It's not about strictly forcing everybody to be vegan all the time, but recentering where the onus is going to be onto plant-based food. And you also talked about doing this in a sustained way over time. I remember doing an initiative in my church and telling people we're going to have this be part of all of our programs for a year. And I remember a year felt important because folks were like, why don't we just do it for one Sunday? And I'm like, no, 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 this isn't a one Sunday thing. We're going to try it for a full year so that it becomes habit. Do you have other tips for people who are trying to create lasting change to food at the level of community?
Uh, Stories is probably the biggest tip I have is invite people to share their stories. That's been the most transformational and the most impactful thing that I've been able to do at my current. I did it at my church in Compton accidentally. So I should also say when I was at this church, I was a senior pastor. I was 29. I had people that were in their 60s and 70s, and they treated me like I was their grandson. And so it was one of the best experiences I've ever had in my life, quite honestly. Pastoring a small black church in Compton. And so they just told me stories about themselves. And in the telling of the stories, they opened up themselves to me in a way that really was very, very powerful. And it allowed me to see the ways in which they were shaping me and I was shaping them. And so at my current church community, um, when we have different things that we are like a special Sunday or somebody's making something interesting or um, I have had just had people share like the members of our church. She's Honduran, and she talks about the vegan tamales that she makes and why she makes them that way. And she told a story about it like before we ate. And that stuff like that happens like probably every other week, um, because I think food is so tied to who we. If food tells a story, it tells our story. My food, when I make certain things, like I'm making grits tonight, and the grit recipe that I use, the kind of grits I use are from the Carolinas because the kind of grits like my grandma loved. I order these grits because they used to get them when they would go to Mississippi. Uh, they would know where to go to get these grits. Um, and so I've tried to eat other grits and they just don't taste as good, right? So it's like these are like my grits. And so I'm like I have the money now. I'm like, you know what? I'm gonna order and get them shipped all the way over here because it matters to me in a way that it helps me remember and celebrate her especially, but my family, my identity, especially in a time when I feel, and one of the questions in here, actually, I'm gonna answer Nathan's question right here about, um, in the chat where he says, "How is it that you can present all the facts about the harms of the animal product industry to churches, and seminaries and recommend the default veg format, and they still decide it's not for them? What is it about food that makes people think that doing justice with their food choices is a matter of personal preference? It's individualism. And so I think giving people a chance to tell their stories is an invitation to remind them that it's actually you're connected to a deep community of identity, of food choices that have always changed, right? Like the way my student I heard about earlier, Shima, like I have several students from the African continent who are working with me to write their thesis papers and different projects and ideas. And what I've learned is the ways in which I eat as African American is somewhat tied to my African culture, but at the same time different because it had to it had to evolve. And so reminding people that our food choices have necessarily had to evolve, but they still are a part of who we are and they tell a longer story. And when we get caught up in the individualistic framework of it's mine rather than understanding the interconnectedness, right, that we have with each other and community, and solidarity, that to me is the framework with which we can begin to address that problem. Um, and so that is like essential for me. It's helping people understand how we are tied together and how like and how our capacity to actually be there and present for each other and love one another and identify with one another is really the way in which we're gonna be able to do this sustainably and do this work sustainably.
Yeah, you remind me that the most powerful advocates for food systems change, for dietary change, are people who are deeply embedded in the community that they're working in. You know, you talk about the church in Compton where they treated you like a grandchild, and that's a deep level of trust and belovedness from which to approach these sometimes difficult, challenging conversations and issues. You know, it's that's the one of the reasons, I mean, really the reason why the Better Food Foundation has done so much to try to support leaders and organizations that are doing dietary work in specific communities. Uh, Jewish organizations like the Center for Jewish Food Ethics, Christian groups like Creature Kind, groups working in specific racial communities, ethnic communities, local communities. Sometimes I get the sort of pushback that these are kind of small number interventions. Why not focus on advocating towards the mainstream, everyone at once? Uh, and usually my response is that, well, the most powerful, most effective change is that which taps into people's identities. Um, a lot of the people we're training right now are students in universities.
Hmm.
Where they're in environments with people with many different identities, very culturally diverse, racially diverse, economically diverse. Do you have any advice for these student advocates who are encountering people who might not necessarily see them as a kind of trusted, beloved community member, but who's trying to change how food is served, about how they might approach this?
Ooh, man. I think I'm gonna come at this with kind of two different perspectives. One is like if you're a student talking to other students, always approach them with like compassion and understanding. I remember when I was a professor at the University of San Diego for 7 years, I think. And undergrads are very evangelical when it comes to these kinds of things. When they are no they know they're right about something. So I was like, be patient with people, and approach them with compassion and understanding and try to listen with them. I think if you're coming at it from a student and you're trying to help your institution think about changing, then I think you got to figure out what is persuasive to them. Is it a combination of other student voices and budgetary guidance? Like most institutions, you're trying to save money, so you can say, "Hey, this thing that we do, actually, this other option is healthier and better for our planet, and is just as environmentally financially efficient, or maybe a fractional more." And there's a demand. Like you have to kind of figure out what language you have to speak to these people and translate it to them. And that means you just got to ask. Like, you can't make the assumption that, oh, they're gonna know this is the right thing to do. You know, you have to you you have to be humble and say, okay, like this is something that matters to me, and I think it should matter to us as an institution. What and how can I talk about this in a way that's meaningful to you? Because they're gonna think about it and approach it differently. If you're a student researcher in this, then I would say the last piece of advice I would give, if you're like interested in learning more about or doing more work in food justice, I would say embed yourself in the community. Don't just make this an intellectual exercise. I think one of the mistakes I made early on in my career was, and that happens so much when you try and get a PhD, man. You just get all in your head all the time, and people love. The thing is, you get praised for how much you're in your head. You get praised for being so smart, and I think it. What I realized somewhere along the way was the importance of staying connected and writing in a way that was tapped into my community and actually being writing about the people like that because I never left. It's not like I just wasn't talking about that experience because they weren't valuing it. And I decided, I was about to curse. I decided I was gonna say, "F this." I'm gonna write from for my community, from my perspective. Um, and it was really, I think, a liberatory. Like I remember reading Franz Fanon's "Wretched of the Earth," and I was thinking about how I was gonna frame chapter two of the book. And there's a section in there where he talks about colonized intellectuals, and it made me cry because I was like, this is what I'm struggling with. It's this way in which I have internalized these voices around what counts as knowledge and what counts as wisdom. And even though I know better, it was so deeply tied to my thinking, I wasn't naming it. And so naming it gave me some space to give permission to let it go, to let go of trying to appease anybody else other than the community I was trying to work for. And that reorientation was critical for me. And so embed yourself in a community, the people that matter to you, so that you can actually feel like you're being a faithful voice for them, with them, rather than talking to them.
Um, we are in the holiday season right now. And this is often a time when people's identities come to the foreground, sometimes identities that used to be strong in our upbringing that aren't as strong anymore, and we're confronted with them all over again when we see our families. Do you have any advice for people going home for the holidays or going back to a community, maybe with a newfound identity as a vegetarian or vegan or environmental activist, and how to show up?
Yeah, I would say, talk about recognize that people want to have conversations on multiple levels, right? Like there's some like surface level conversations around like, the weather or whatever, and like, that's okay. But don't try to get caught up in arguments around um what I want to say identity politics, but that's not really it. There's like a deeper way of um try to talk about shared values. That's probably a better way to say it. Talk about shared values and the things that actually are meaningful to both of you, and the feelings that you have around a particular subject and why this matters to you. Try to take things down from the level of like rhetoric to feelings. Like, because I think that for me is, and that's hard. Why do you ask somebody, stay curious if someone responds to you in a way that's negative, be like, well, why do you feel this way? Rather than getting defensive and arguing, make them say, well, what does this matter to you so much that I don't want to eat this way anymore? Like, what, why do you feel this way? Enforce, enforce invite them to do some internal to some internal analysis as to what's coming up for them, because it probably is revealing something to them that they hadn't really thought about or wrestled with. But often I have found when I'm able to get to the place of shared values, it's really helpful for people. Um, or helpful for me to say this is something we actually hold in common, whether it be the sacred text or these words or this framework or this approach, and we can agree that this matters. Now let me tell you why, because it matters, I've made these choices, right? And so that's a much easier place to have a conversation rather than, arguing around facts that other people will say, well, these are alternative facts, right? That doesn't do anybody any good. But if you can invite them to get to the level of their feelings and have a conversation around there, I think that's and produces a more fruitful conversation. And there's always, you can always say, I got to go to the bathroom and just leave. Or somebody made a comment around toddlers. I'm like, oh, my son, I have to go over there. So I'm like, yeah, sometimes you just gotta find your escape. You gotta find your escape clause and just be able to get out.
Um, so we've been talking about the importance of acknowledging identity, right? Actually paying attention consciously to the way that people's identities, whether religious or racial or professional or familial, influence them, and paying conscious attention to that when we try to engage with them around food. But there is one identity that, at the Better Food Foundation, at least, we don't bring up very often, and that is vegan identity. In fact, we generally encourage the advocates who we train to talk less about vegan identity and instead to talk about how food connects, how plant-based food connects to other identities people hold. eat plant-based because you are Christian, eat plant-based because you are an environmentalist, not eat plant-based because you have joined this exclusive community of vegans. But I know it's not exactly as simple as that. I'm curious about how vegan identity as a vegan or being in a community of vegans has played a role in your life. Is it something that you have positive feelings about, something that you've embraced or not?
That's a great question. I would say part of the reason I took a more, well, I think lots of reasons I took a more slow approach where I became a vegetarian and over time became a vegan was because I needed to learn how to do it, and I talked about that and I didn't want to rush it. But I remember there's this one episode of The Simpsons, and I wish I could remember. I almost wish I had the meme where one of the kids says. He says something like, I'm a level 5 vegan. I don't eat anything with a shadow or something like that. And I remember just like, because that was my understanding of vegans. Like, just like people are, it's just you're taking it too far. And I think that's the framework that so many people have is that it's this competition, and it's so, and honestly, because of the state of the world, because I'm so steeped in fighting like against Christian nationalism, it sounds so much of the same kind of cult-like rhetoric that you hear from these people that are evangelicals that have adopted these principles that are doing so much harm. It's the same. Well, it feels like the same logic to people because you're so much like you come at people so self-righteously, right? You just like, and that triggers people in a way that is a turnoff when it comes to denying them something. And I think that within this Christian nationalist framework, for them, it's a fight for the retaining of some kind of power and identity they believe they have, um, and that matters to them. I think for me, I had to I had to come up with and develop Black veganism as a way to think about what it meant to be vegan that wasn't already co-opted into kind of white sources of knowledge. I was about to say white epistemologies, but like white ways of being in the world, because I think the idea of what it meant to be vegan had already been so um, within my poor Black communities, not even middle class Black communities, but poor Black communities, it was already too tainted to rescue. But if I was going to talk about it, I had to talk about it in a way that was specifically tied to my identity and my culture. Um, and so talking about Black veganism, creating the idea of what I'm talking about as practicing Black veganism, talking about from a religious perspective was essential. I don't know that I could have actually been as persuasive in my arguments to my family, especially had I not developed it. And so, yeah, I find that label somewhat challenging depending on where I am. And what's interesting? It's been I don't it's that I think people just know now because it sounds so bad. But I go places and people are like, "Oh, that's this person who's a vegan." Like people just know, and that in some ways sounds arrogant. I know even as it came out of my mouth, but like I was at the American Academy of Religion, and my book has been out for a while, and people know. And so like I don't have to say anything. In some ways it takes the burden off. But in other places I just eat how I eat. I don't say anything about it. And then people ask questions. People always ask questions. Like all the time. Because I think we start this conversation with people making assumptions around who you are. When I order some food and I eat with people and I have not say anything about the fact that I'm a vegan, and they're like, "Oh, you don't have any meat." They're like, "Are you vegetarian? Are you vegan?" Like all the time, all the time. No one just and I don't really say anything. I don't even. I'm like, you just people. Maybe you got I don't know. Maybe you got a gastrointestinal problem. Like I don't say anything about anybody else's food, right? Like I just let it be. But people always feel they are shocked, like they are surprised. Maybe it's the dreads. I don't know. But the way I look, it invites inquisit like questions around my diet. So. That's kind of where I landed, right? It's not a word I use necessarily unless I'm having the modifier of Black in front of it.
Yeah. Um, do you, I'm looking, you've already answered some of the questions from the chat. I want to go back to some of them. And anybody, if you have questions that have come up, now is a great time to add them to the chat. Um, Trevor
Yep.
asks about a disability rights framework, and you mentioned being more conscious of that now because of your son. Uh, Yeah, how has that shaped your views on food and diet and all the issues surrounding it?
It has. I think having a child has shaped, and then having a child with intellectual disabilities. So my son is autistic and has ADHD, and I think um, it's made me more conscious of how I need to think about what it means to invite people to make their for choice and agency, and how we think about what does it mean to be a full human being, which I've been thinking about for forever, right? Honestly, like what does it mean to be a full human being? But the ways in which disabled bodies are dehumanized and fall into the same kind of broader category. So it's made me probably more think about more critically about how to incorporate um, veganism or disability advocacy into a vegan framework as a way to talk about an argument for an anti-oppressive politics, an argument for humanization, because of the ways in which, I mean, you see it taking place right now. If you listen to the rhetoric coming out of what Pete Hegseth is saying, it's all around a certain kind of projection of masculinity. And it's all, I mean, it is the classic rhetoric of an idea of what a human being is. It's a cisgender man that looks a certain kind of way. And it's so yeah. So for me, it's more about pushing back against that. I think as it relates to other thing, last thing I say as it relates to kids, I've been much more mindful of talking about why we eat what we eat and helping him understand the choices so that when he goes out, he can talk about it in a way that allows him to feel connected rather than like disconnected from the other kids around him. Um, and that's been interesting actually because kids tease. Like kids tease. And I don't want him to feel like he's being shut out. And so trying to help him understand that because he's already black. Like he's already like, there's all these other things he's already dealing with. So I'm like, am I giving him this additional burden? How am I helping equip him to engage the world? It's just helped me think through a lot of different things about um yeah, what does it mean for me to think critically about the different other bodies, including children's, and how they may or may not be included in terms of seeing them as their own agents, in yeah, their own moral agents.
Oh, well, thank you so much. We only have a few minutes left, so I want to give you a chance to spotlight any other projects you have working on that you might want to point people to, or things you're doing there that you're excited about that maybe you haven't gotten a chance to mention yet.
Well, I saw somebody had a comment in the chat about have I thought about writing a cookbook. Um, I am I'm friends with uh people who who are well-known chefs and cooks and have talked to me about it. I don't know that I will. Um, I don't. I love to cook. Absolutely love to cook. I think it scares me in funny ways because I can take people criticizing my academic work because I'm like I can make an argument why I think I'm right and why they may be wrong. But when people if you criticize my food, that will hurt my feelings. Like it will hurt my feelings. And so like I'm like I don't know if I can subject myself to that level of rejection. That's actually really gonna like hurt me in a way, which is so funny. But that's just the honest truth. That really is it's sensitive. It really is sensitive. So in some ways, it helps me. It reminds me of the way in which we're talking about inviting people to change and how that is sensitive to our identity. Um, I think the other question I think that someone had in here about basically was can I use my authority to make people make choices or to enforce something. And I could use my authority in lots of ways like that. I try not to because I find that if I'm able to invite broader conversations, it creates a sustainable change over time rather than it feeling like something we're doing because this is what the pastor said to do or what the teacher said to do or um, with the exception of like explicitly things that like maybe a couple of things, but for the most part, it's always about a conversation. The last thing I would say is, I'm not necessarily, I have all kinds of stuff I'm always working on. But if you're interested in learning more about like the intersection of religion and like social justice activism, I know we mentioned about the podcast I have earlier, and I know lots of people have podcasts, but this is actually like I was at an event for people who the podcast we have, the Progressive Christians podcast, is a like social political podcast that's talks about issues like this, um, and it's going to be pretty big. I'm actually really excited about it. We have about 10,000 people listen to it per month, which is like insane. So I'm very fortunate to be at a church that funds it, and because it is a lot of work, but it's a way for us to push back against, um, you know, the white Christian nationalist rhetoric, but that faces us. And I know many of you are from many different religious traditions, but I, as a person of faith, as a Christian especially, I feel as though it is my duty to push back against what I see as the people in this country doing harm, using my religion in ways that harms other people. So I'm spending a lot of time working on that right now because that feels more important. It feels the most important actually to so many things I'm working on. So yeah, that and parenting, that's pretty much occupies. It takes up most of my tonight I have something after Isaiah goes to bed. We're already putting together Christmas presents. So this is this is my life. This is my life.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Christopher, for joining us, spending this time with us, and all the ways that you've supported EFF and our partner organizations over the years. It's just been a real pleasure talking to you.
Thank you for having me. It was great seeing you all. And I wish you all good luck in the projects that you're doing.